say that Alice Palmer was a significant mentor to your president and the woman who got him his first job in politics. But she had a little bit of a history. Back in 1980, Alice Palmer was invited by a man called Maurice Bishop, the president of Grenada in the Caribbean, to the first anniversary celebrations of that country's Marxist-Leninist revolution. It was Maurice Bishop, in 1983, he was murdered by his own comrades, and Ronald Reagan sent troops onto the island to shut it all down. And he's glad, it's very good he did, because that was going to be the second Cuba of the Caribbean. The Soviets were not happy about that one at all. So in 1983, Alice Palmer was in Prague in communist Czechoslovakia for a meeting of the World Peace Council. Now that's very significant because the World Peace Council was the Soviet Union's, and it still exists today, the Soviet Union's #1 international front. They put billions of rubles into this, and its job was to propagandize against NATO, against Star Wars, against your military alliances around the globe, to spread lies and disinformation in the third world against America. Its job was to destroy your military through propaganda. And it was their #1 front. And Alice Palmer was intimately involved in it. She was also involved in the US affiliate, the United States Peace Council, which still exists. She served on its national executive along with 16 members of the Communist Party USA and a woman called Barbara Lee, who now serves as a Democrat congresswoman out of California. And when all the California Democrats were all going for Hillary in 2008, guess who the first one was to stand up for Mr. Obama? It's Barbara Lee. So Alice Palmer was also running the Black Press Institute out of Chicago, which was a nationwide network of black communist journalists, some of whom were connected to the Palestine Liberation Organization, the terrorist group. And these people, their job was to sow Soviet propaganda amongst your country's black population. In 1985, she took 16 of these people to Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and the Soviet Union for meetings with high-ranking government officials and the editor of Pravda. The same year, she was in Moscow covering the annual conference of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The same year, she was also elected as North American Vice President of the International Organization of Journalists, another bona fide international Soviet front. So her job in that organization was to monitor activities for the Soviets in the United States, Canada, the Caribbean, and Mexico. So to put it bluntly, Alice Palmer was a high-level Soviet agent of influence, intimately connected with at least high-ranking officials in 3 Soviet bloc governments and 2 major Soviet international fronts. So Frank Marshall Davis, communist, possible Soviet spy; Alice Palmer, Democrat and definite Soviet agent of influence, both of them involved in anti-US military activities. Very important to remember that. So what about Mr. Obama now? And I'm sure you don't want to stay here till 4 o'clock in the morning. The people around him now, you know. I'll pick on 3, okay, who I consider the most important. The first one, the other half of Mr. Obama's brain. And even the liberals call her that. Dear old Valerie, okay? The woman who got Obama who introduced Obama to his wife, and now sits in the White House as his closest friend and most trusted advisor. The most powerful woman in America, though she's never been elected to anything. So what about her pedigree? Well, Valerie Jarrett's mother is a woman called Barbara Bowman, child psychologist out of Chicago, runs the Erickson Institute. It's had a lot of influence on early childhood education in your country. In 2009, Mr. Obama gave Barbara Bowman an award for her work, and that ceremony was featured prominently in the pages of the Communist Party's People's World. The Ericsson Institute. Now, is there any former 60s hippies here? Oh, good. I knew there'd be a few. Yep. Well, some of you might remember the phrase identity crisis. He's having an identity crisis. Leave him alone. Well, that was Erik Erikson. He was an errant disciple of Sigmund Freud. Back in the 1940s, he was kicked out of Berkeley in California. It was different then, because he refused to sign an anti-communist loyalty oath. He was a lecturer at the California Labor School, the Communist Party's main trade union school at the time. On the board of the Ericsson Institute have served Tom Ayers, the father of Weather Underground terrorist Bill Ayers, and Bernadine Dawn, the wife of Bill Ayers and a famous terrorist in her own right. Now you go back a bit further. Valerie Jarrett's maternal grandfather, Robert Taylor, first black head of the Chicago Housing Authority. 1940, he was serving in the executive and the leadership of the Chicago branch of the American Peace Mobilization. And you'll hear this word peace all the time, because that was the Communist Party's main front of the era. Do you know what their job was? They were campaigning to keep your boys out of World War II. Their slogans were, keep the troops at home, no American boys for Europe, let Europe solve Europe's problems. Because at the time, the Nazis were overrunning Europe and about to conquer Britain. But they were still allies at that time of the Soviet Union. They'd signed a non-aggression pact. So Comrade Stalin had ordered your American communists to make sure that your boys were not sent to Europe to save Britain. But then in 1941, Hitler betrayed Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union. And within 24 hours, the American Peace Mobilization became the American People's Mobilization. The most pro-war, let's get Hitler, let's destroy the Nazis organisation in the country. Get the boys overseas. That's what it was all about. They wanted to spill your blood and you spend your treasure to save the Soviet Union. That is how deep the communist commitment to peace is. Peace when it suits. So, and Robert Taylor served on the executive of that organisation and another communist front in Chicago, the American Civil Liberties Union. That'll surprise you, won't it?
Yeah.
With a man called Frank Marshall Davis on both organisations. The other half of Valerie Jarrett's family, her late father-in-law, Vernon Jarrett. Vernon Jarrett was a black Chicago journalist, very prominent. The last thing he did when he was dying of cancer in 2004 was to issue a call to the black population of Chicago to get out and vote for Mr. Obama in that year's Senate primaries. Go back to 1946. Vernon Jarrett was serving on the Illinois State Executive of a wonderful sounding organisation, American Youth for Democracy. I'm sure you'd all love your children to belong to it. Well, guess which political party it was the youth wing of? Communist Party USA. Go forward 2 years, 1948. Vernon Jarrett was serving on the Packing House Workers Strike Committee, Publicity Committee. Packing House workers were a communist union out on strike, and Vernon Jarrett was writing their press releases and propaganda. And on that little publicity committee with Vernon Jarrett served a man called Frank Marshall Davis. Now, isn't it interesting that these two most powerful people in America, Obama and Valerie Jarrett, can both trace their political lineage back to the Chicago Communist Party of the 1940s and specifically to Mr. Davis. Wouldn't read about it, would you? Except in there. So what about the other half of Mr. Obama's brain, which doesn't leave very much? Joe Biden, perhaps? Bit of a cheap shot. Okay, David Axelrod. Dirty David. The man who wins elections by blackening the name of his opponents. When Mr. Obama was running for Senate in 2004, his Republican opponent was a shoo-in, way ahead in the polls. But some secret divorce records were illegally unsealed, somebody was paid off, a sex scandal was revealed, and Jack Ryan was sunk. And you look at the campaign today, if anybody saw the DNC, it was just all attack on the Republican Party, on the Tea Party, on Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan, negative, negative, negative. And that is why Mr. Romney has to face stories, bogus stories about gay haircuts when he was a young man. And incidentally, the Communist Party and the Democratic Socialists of America, the two organisations most closely linked to Obama, have been pushing a story recently that Bain Capital was connected to the El Salvadorian death squads. just watch for that one. That's what they do. But where did Mr. Axelrod learn his trade? Well, back in the 1970s, when he went to Hyde Park, Chicago to study political science, he was picked up and mentored by two very prominent local journalists / activists, Don Rose and David S. Cantor. Now, Rose and Cantor had run a little publication in Hyde Park called the Hyde Park. Well, the two men, they mentored Axelrod for several years. They worked together as a team in two political campaigns, and they got the man his first job in politics, his first job in journalism. They mentored him for 5 or 6 years at least. But before they'd done that, they run a little publication in Hyde Park called the Hyde Park Kenwood Voices. And it was the voice of the Communist Party in the area. It carried articles about trips to North Vietnam to aid the communists, about going to Cuba to cut sugarcane for Castro. It also had a regular column by a local congressman named Abner Mikva. And he was very much part of their operation. He's right into it. Now, Mikva in Congress was a big opponent of gun rights. That's what he campaigned on. When he left Congress, he became an open supporter of the Marxist group Democratic Socialists of America, and as a law professor at the University of Chicago, he befriended and mentored for several years Mr. Obama. He also befriended and mentored another American lawyer who I'm sure you're all familiar with, and that is Elena Kagan, who now serves on your Supreme Court. So, Don Rose, one half of the partnership, Communist Party fronter since the 1940s. He served on the executive committee of a wonderful sounding organisation, another great organisation, the Chicago Committee to Defend the Bill of Rights. Wouldn't you all like to support that? Communist Party's main front in Chicago. It was Don Rose that coined the famous phrase, "The whole world is watching." And that was during the riots in Chicago in 1968, the big SDS riots in 1968, which Don Rose helped to organise. The other half of the partnership, David Cantor. His father was a man called Harry Cantor, leader of the Massachusetts Communist Party in the 1930s. In 1932, he took his whole family, including baby David, to the Soviet Union where they lived for many years. He was granted a personal audience with Comrade Stalin and was employed translating Lenin's works from Russian into English. Now, if you're a communist, that is the equivalent of translating the Bible. That is a very honoured position. By the late 1940s, both Harry Cantor and David Cantor were living in Chicago, both active members of the Communist Party. And in 1948, Harry Cantor bought a little communist publication, the Chicago Star, off its owner. And why did the owner want to sell it? Well, he was moving to Hawaii, wasn't he? Because that was Frank Marshall Davis. So you go forward to 1960. David Cantor and his best friend, another Communist Party member called Leroy Wolins, who incidentally founded Veterans for Peace, yet another Communist Party anti-military front, had a little publication company called it Trans World Publications. And they weren't going capitalist because they were getting a regular subsidy from the Soviet embassy in Washington to distribute communist literature all over your country. the two men were formally required by your government to register as agents of the Soviet Union. Now go forward to 1964. Anybody remember the famous race that year between Barry Goldwater and Lyndon Johnson?
Yes.
Were you any Goldwater girls here?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Good for you, guys. Good for you. And Goldwater guys too, no doubt. But that was a big deal, that race. And, you know,